particularly in the UK, it feels like we're at a bit of a turning point almost. Do we sort out the housing crisis? Do we sort out some of these challenges?
Tom Nicholas is a YouTuber who makes videos about politics, history and culture. He made a film called Boomers, The Rise of the Gerontocracy. Did the system thrive because of them or in spite of them?
We sort of rewrote the vision of what a human life looks like around the experience of the baby boomers.
Yeah.
And now that's quite difficult to access.
It feels like we've found the can. We've been kicking it down the road a long time, and it's like, okay, the can is here. We can't kick this thing any further. Like,
Why did you make your biggest piece of work, your biggest project about boomers?
It was something that I'd found myself coming back to in other videos I've been making in various different ways, whether that was boomers themselves and that kind of topic, or whether it was changes which have happened throughout the second half of the 20th century. And this felt like a good opportunity to tie some of those things up and to make something at that kind of film scale, but also with that language of film as well, which I think does allow you to dig a little bit deeper than maybe a half an hour YouTube project does.
I got that. So watching it, I know I'm a YouTuber, so I know all about like retention editing and things.
You're a YouTuber. You never ever mention it, Damo. I've never heard you say that.
I thought you should bring it up, mate. Yeah. Well, why are you here? But yeah, so, and I was coming into it, and I know your YouTube work, so I watched it, and I was like, this format allows for such like beautiful moments that you just wouldn't get in YouTube. So one that like shone out to me was when your mom was like, I've never really thought about being a boomer. And I was like, you wouldn't get that because you wouldn't even really sat down with your mom on a YouTube video. You'd just been like, this is this and this and this and this. That blew my mind because, we define ourselves by generations, but you had a guy that was into demographics as well, who was like, oh, we had the boomers, we named them because they were a big generation. And then we had the guys that came after, and we were meant to stop there, and we've just kept going and going and going. Why do you think the modern person, young people, are so obsessed with generations?
Yeah, so that was Philip Cohen, who was a sociologist, demographer that I spoke to in just outside Washington, D.C., in Maryland. That's the particular place. So it was quite a whirlwind couple of weeks of going to lots of different places. But yeah, he was kind enough to have us out to the university campus there and to speak with me. And yeah, his strongly held position is that generations, as we usually use those terms and those labels, are mostly bunk, right? Yeah. It is useful to recognize that people have different experiences based on when they are born and when they go through certain life experiences, for example. So, probably the period at which you finish school and do or don't go to university and what the job market is like at that point is going to have like a reasonable effect on your life chances after that. So whether you go through that in 2005 or 2009 makes a big difference. Whether you go through that in, 2017 or the middle of the COVID pandemic, that can make quite a big difference to your life. And there's kind of two ways that can be really useful of measuring those things. One is with a uniform block of time. So we go, everyone that's born in the 1990s, everyone that's born in the 2000s, everyone's born in the 2010s, or you want 5-year divisions, whatever you want to do. The other, and sort of the original idea of generations, this book called The Problem of Generations, which came out sort of early 20th century, was that sort of big world historical events really affect how certain people experience the world, right? So the First World War, for example, people who were of, I guess particularly men who were of a fighting age in 1914, that's quite a unifying experience in which maybe the age that you are becomes as or more in some ways important than maybe other factors. So suddenly the fact that one of you earns twice as much as the other, and another period in time that might be really, really important, in that moment in time, you've both just spent however many years in the trenches or whatever, and suddenly actually when you're born becomes a really key part of your identity. And so that can be really useful as well, right? We might talk about a COVID generation. We might talk about multiple COVID generations in terms of, young people who were at school during COVID, where that has been had massive impact on their schooling and their education. We also might talk about, people at other ages who have gone through COVID, and that's affected their lives in different ways. Our current way in which we talk about generations is sort of neither of those things, with the exception of the boomers, which maybe we'll come back to. But Generation X, Millennials, Gen Z, Generation Alpha, I think, is the thing we're going.
The skibbities.
For.
Yeah.
They're pretty arbitrary in terms of how they're measured. They're different lengths of time. One of Philip's things was that the length of a generation is going down, because if you're someone who is either a demographer and maybe you're an academic, maybe you're a kind of marketing person, naming the next one is really good. Like, that's really cool, isn't it? Like, being the person who was like, we're going to call it this, pretty good. So like, people are kind of like, when can I get away with being like, this is generation blah, blah, blah. Even within that, though, I sometimes see some quite funny comments on the internet, like people talking. People are like, "Oh, I'm an elder millennial," or I'm a young Gen Alpha or whatever. And you're kind of like, well, okay, well, if you've decided that the category is really, really important, and then you're sort of subdivide, like, at what point are we just like, I'm 32 years old. Yeah. And we're just back at the beginning.
I was born in May.
I'm Dave.
But we do live in a time broadly where identity feels like a really thing that is really important to people, and as a kind of nail in the ground of who we are. And I think that's probably the case at any point throughout history. But this seems to be one of those things that people have really stuck to. And part of that, I think, is that we do. I mean, any times are tumultuous in some respect, aren't they? But it does feel that, particularly in terms of life chances and life opportunities and kind of experiences of life, that just feel as though we are living through a rough patch, as it were, where when you were born can be a really big factor in terms of what your experience of life, and particularly, I think, stability is.
Something that sociologist said I thought was interesting was that, like you said, he said after boomers, there weren't really meant to be too many more. There weren't meant to be other classes and groups. But he said that like millennials and like Gen Z have quite a lot in common, and boomers are just kind of on their own to the side, and all the other ones are kind of not that different to each other. Do you think that's true?
Well, yeah. So boomers is the sort of baby boomer generation, probably adheres more to the model of generations as being defined by a particular thing that's happening, right?
Yeah.
So I guess quite basically, in the post-war period, so Second World War ends, everyone sort of comes home that was away. We see this like massive sort of bulge of babies being born across kind of several countries, particularly the US and the UK, but we also see it in a bunch of other sort of broadly speaking wealthy countries. And from about 1946 to about 1964, that kind of continues. And so unlike other generations, which sort of all have kind of weird names, that one has one that very much refers to this kind of demographic event where we get just a bunch more people born after a period when birth rates have been going down, and actually similar to what we're seeing at the moment, where a lot of people are kind of fretting about that. People were kind of really worried about what was going to happen in terms of would there be enough young people. There was sort of this big spike, and you get this massive generation which passes through, and that has sort of continued to have ramifications throughout the rest of the lives of those people, and also everyone living around them as well. And it's slightly different in different countries. So the US sort of has a slightly more boom shape. The UK has kind of two quite clear peaks. And And the experience within those years is also a really telling and interesting one of that. It is those post-war years where European economy, American economy, much of the global economy is just roaring, and so it creates a very particular experience of the world. And yet there are so many baby boomers that I think one of the things that's happened, and maybe this bleeds into why so many young people kind of really see generation as a really key part of their identity, is that I think one of the things we did is we sort of rewrote the vision of what a human life looks like around the experience of the baby boomers.
Yeah.
And now that's quite difficult to access.
Even though either side of it didn't exist potentially. Like
Yeah,
before it,
yeah.
there was life expectancy and quality wasn't that great. Like you say, people were in the war and go beyond that, and the average person wasn't living a great experience.
Yeah, go back to 1912 or something and talk to someone about the housing ladder, and they'll be like, what? What does that mean? The baby boomers, the sort of enough affluence that people leave their kids in school slightly longer, university attendance begins to go up, slightly less here in the UK than in the US. It's a lot bigger, but there's a sort of cultural shift around how view young people, starting work and then getting on the career ladder and getting on the housing ladder, climbing the career ladder. All of this stuff is actually quite particular to the baby boomer experience. And yet we've kind of universalized it just at the right amount of time for it to become really difficult to access. And at the other end of that, like the long retirement.
Golden Years was invented as a marketing slogan to sell a retirement village in Arizona.
Yeah.
In like the 50s. And like people are like, they internalize this idea of retirement as if that's a God-given right, you know, whereas...
And I don't think that is a bad thing. Like, I don't think this is boomers were fat on the frivolities of the actually, would we prefer older people in our society when they are unable to work to be able to not put themselves through physical and mental strain to kind of keep themselves in food and shelter? Yeah, that's probably a good standard for society to set. And yet so many aspects of that kind of narrative have become really hard to access. I mean, like, I always think about the housing ladder as being this really interesting one. This idea that you're going to buy a starter home. You can still hear people use that phrase quite a lot. And then you're going to gradually buy a slightly bigger home, but a bigger home as, I guess, in the idyllic vision of this, it's that your family grows or whatever, but you're going to climb up this ladder, and then just before retirement, you're going to downsize, you're going to release all that equity, and you're going to be like, great, I can kick back. Is that a realistic vision of how you're going to engage with the housing market if you're a young person today? Probably not. You're maybe going to buy a house. You might move houses, but are you going to, keep buying a bigger and bigger house and then downsize it?
It requires an ever-increasing property market.
Yeah.
I think house prices between 1951 and 2024 went up like 151 times. To do that again over the next, the average house price would be 43 million. Yeah. And you've got to ask yourself, is that kind of growth realistic? And inflation will do a number on it, yeah, sure, but it was exceptional, the house price growth, unlikely to happen. And if it does, people wouldn't even be able to get on the ladder, like you say, at the start.
The challenge at the moment is that house prices to wages have separated massively. Yeah. I think we're well over 7 times now. I think
depends where you're looking.
Saying, and it depends where you're looking in the country, but it gets to that point where your salary isn't increasing as much as the gap to the next house on the ladder or whatever. So actually, people might move house for like practical reasons, but are you going to gradually work up to that detached house in the countryside or whatever? Probably not. And yet we still have all the language of this that floats around.
And especially because that boomer generation have lived that experience and might be the parents of the people going, well, just do what I did, buy a property. I got a question then about the boomer generation and this large block of people that moved through the economic system. And I think you did a really good job of showing, like, at every milestone, these guys just changed the game, right? Did the system thrive because of them or in spite of them? Was the economic prosperity of like the 50s and post-World War as a result of this large population base, or were they just lucky that it was happening at the same time?
I think that's one of the really challenging aspects of like covering this topic, and maybe something that I pulled my punches on a little bit. Initially, I was like, I'm gonna make this film called Boomers, and it's gonna one of the poster ideas we went through was just sort of like an old hand giving the middle finger. And I sat there and I looked at it for a while, and I was like, it's sort of great. It's really eye-catching, and it tells a story in the way that you want a poster for something to do.
Be a great thumbnal,
Great thumbnail.
Yeah.
But I was
A
just
little
like,
bit clickbait, maybe.
I was like, if you're 60, 70, 80, and you see that poster, are you going to watch the film? And I was like, no. And I also have a bit of a thing in terms of like thumbnails and stuff, posters, titles, whatever, where I do think it's always worth thinking of that as a sort of product in and of itself, in terms of a thing you're putting out into the world. Like, most people who see a thumbnail or see a poster or whatever aren't going to watch the thing. And so at that point, have I just put this really abrasive, kind of insightful thing into the world? So what was so is it that, like, so is it their fault or is it not, is kind of the question. And I did loads of research going into Boomers and read the sort of invectives that are like, can I say fuck? Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
you tell me. You get the
like,
buzzer for the...
Sorry. Yeah, no, that was for the invective. What's an invective?
Oh, just really critical, like angry, targeted, like fuck the Boomers, like they've done all this to the world. And then some stuff that was more, these are events which have happened around the times at which the Boomers were alive. I'm sure many listeners will have heard a lot about kind of demographic crises at the moment in terms of what does that look like for the economy going forward. Because young people spend money and people buy things for their children and all of this kind of stuff. And we know that is like part of the growth story of the second half of the 20th century. I mean, also a lot of the world was destroyed during the Second World War. You have a lot to build, you have a lot to reconstruct, that creates jobs, that gets money moving through things. And there's this really kind of interesting kind of way in which the world looks at those post-war challenges after the Second World War, where they're kind of like, well, everything's like pretty screwed. Like a lot of like, London's a lot of rubble. So Plymouth, where I live, basically gets completely rebuilt because we've got dockyards, which just completely, the whole city centre is just like gone.
One of the pillars of personal finance is having an emergency fund so that you can withstand financial shocks. But the value of holding on to lots of cash beyond that is questionable because it just gets eaten away by inflation. You should put that money to work, and really the same goes for any money that's in your business. There's an amount you want to hold in your business account to ensure that you can weather any storms, but then you want to put the rest of the money to work, and where should you do that? I use Tide's Instant Saver account for this scenario, and they're offering new customers 3.81% AER variable on unlimited deposits until June 1st, 2025. I even use it for stuff like putting all my tax money in, so my up and coming VAT bill, I stick it in there so I can generate a little bit of a return on it in the meantime. If you'd like to give it a go, then use the code MAKINGMONEYQ1 and you'll get £100 if you add £5,000 in the first 30 days. There's a link in the description for you where you can also find a link to the full T's and C's and Tides terms. The variable rate is correct as of the 6th of February, 2025.
It's kind of like we can use the reason that we need to rebuild everything as sort of economic stimulus. That's loads of jobs, that's loads of money moving through the economy, and that kind of helps too. And then in terms of the kind of the other end of things, there is a way of viewing this story, and I don't think there's a right answer here. There's a way of viewing this story where we view it as, the Boomers sort of soaked up all of, like a world that had built around them, a world that had gone, we've got loads more kids, we'll build loads more schools, we want to get more people into university, we're going to sell off all our council housing to them as they get to that age. We're then going to... There was a period kind of through the boomers' primes where you could discount the interest off your mortgage from your taxes. That kind of only existed for the period in which the boomers went through it. It doesn't exist anymore.
DB pensions,
yeah.
triple lock even.
Yeah, like all of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's a way where you can do this story. You can go, well, boomers have intentionally made, if we're looking at the sort of UK lens now, like have sort of made the world work in that way. There's another kind of maybe a little blamey way, but a little bit more like friendly way of putting it, I guess, where we go, well, it's just a large voting block. And so, of course, of course, we've now got triple lock on pensions because older people are a big voting block, and who's going to be the politician that goes, we're not going to do that anymore.
That's why the Rolling Stones are still on tour. That's what the guy said. And I was like, that's genius.
Yeah, big market.
Because it's a big market. Like they're popular of that time. They keep going because there's so many boomers still buying tickets.
So part of the thing of the kind of story of the boomers as this sort of like universalized story of what life looks like in the modern age or whatever, is there's what I like to call the kind of boomer nostalgia porn industry, which I can think sort of Forrest Gump
Simmer down, right?
is like...
I don't know.
Such a jackass.
New category, what's this?
Starts taking notes.
which is this kind of like Forrest Gump is like the prototypical example of this, of you tell a story of someone's life and I think he's like a year out to be a boomer or something, but they're born just after the war, and there's sort of a story that happens, but also you do a social history alongside it, right? And that's like kind of, what David Willett says when I chat to him in the film, and he says, the reason the Rolling Stones are on tour is that there's so many boomers around to go and watch them, but also because there was so many baby boomers and they've sort of had control of like the levers of cultural discernment for so long or whatever, like the ability to say what's good and what's not. It means that, bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, all of whom are great. I love a lot of that music.
Say what you think.
But we get to... No, I genuinely love all that. I've not seen the Bob Dylan film yet. I would like to. But also, we have this that is the greatest music that has ever existed.
Yeah.
Which is, maybe some of it is. Maybe there's also a few that are kind of, riding along on... Would people be listening to the Monkees if it wasn't if that music hadn't come out when the boomers happens to be in their teens or whatever? That really fizzled out.
No. I think it's great.
I think what I learned from your film was really interesting. There's so much about the boomers that was special. So it was like a perfect storm almost. With the war, and then they did all the building and manufacturing, and then that created more jobs. And then they all started having more babies because of after the war, but also the medical advances meant that more children were surviving childbirth. So that's how they all had so I thought it was just because, the war's over, let's all just repopulate the country and start having babies. But it was actually because the medical advances as well at the same time, so they could have more babies. And most importantly, Sue was a very common name, and both your mums were called Sue.
Yeah. So, that's a bigger identifier of that generation to your mom than her age.
With her, I tried to get to the bottom of that one. I was sort of like, well, did my gran have a good reason? Was there famous? Because sometimes you're like,
famous Susan.
Oh, great. If there's, I don't know if there's lots of Elsas, but if there was, you'd be like, oh, brilliant. Frozen came out, right? But now she's just there's quite a lot of them.
It's funny how they're like a hive mind of boomers or whatever, where they just are Susan. Just put a million Susans on the planet at once.
That's going to be it.
Because and Mandy's, But okay then. There's a scene in it. I think what I want to talk about wealth now, because one of the key criticisms of the boomers is they got all the money, they got all the wealth, all the power as well. You're doing this scene where you've got Werther's Originals, I think, which I loved. I was I did a little nod to the old elderly there, and you're filling up a jar and you show that the boomers basically in every Western economy control a large portion of the wealth, and you've just said there that they're the biggest voting bloc as well. one question first of all, shouldn't they have the most wealth and the most power because they've got the most lived experience? You know, they're going to be the best leaders. Should we not look up to our elders and go, you've got the wisdom? And they'll have the most money because they've been compounding it for longer than a 20-year-old. You know?
Yeah. No. So there's always, probably always going to be an extent to which older parts of the population will have more money, whether that's cash or whether that's wealth, than younger people, right? As you say, if you've been saving or investing, it's had longer to build. If you bought a house and the value of that house has gone up, then that's going to have happened. If you've been in your career longer, yeah, you're probably going to have had chances for promotions and for bonuses and pay rises and what have you. What we've seen is, I don't have the exact figures on me, but is that the proportion of the wealth that is kind of owned, controlled, whatever you want to say, by that baby boomer portion of the population, or by the age cohort, which is now the baby boomers, has increased over
20%.
time. Over the,
I've got it written here. So it's gone from 45 to 67.5 since. This is your stats, not mine. I'm just coming in and taking the glory, a bit like this guy. Since 2005.
Yeah.
So are you saying that's the problem, that 20 odd percent?
and those might be US statistics if they're from the film.
I mean, maybe it's, if it's America, if it's the UK, what you're saying is that there's been a huge shift since the millennium, basically, in the percentage of the wealth that cohort holds as the total.
And I think a lot of that is to sort of, I guess, to go into some marks accidentally, sort of, wealth is as much like a social relation as it is a sort of thing that you have, right? So a shift in the way that we view housing actually can look up numbers like that, and it can look like we have the same amount of stuff and it's just in different places. Whereas actually we can be in a place wherein what's actually happened is that our relationship with stuff like pensions and stuff like housing has changed in a way that shifts those numbers because the things that we do with wealth have changed. In actual fact, my mum has the same amount of houses as she had when she was like 30 years ago, right? She still has one house. The value of that house in relation to in inflation or whatever has gone up. And therefore that appears in a certain way on paper in some of those statistics in a way that looks like things have moved around. Whereas actually what's happened is that, you know, there has been a shift in our relationship with pensions, our relationship with houses, rather than just like numbers moving around on the sheet, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I made a video recently where I looked at like the median savings by age and where the money's kept. And one way to present that data is to go, here's the median 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 40-year-old, all the way up. So by the time you're 60, you should be there. But actually what you're looking at is a snapshot of a timeline of circumstances and housing markets and pensions that won't be replicated. So the 20-year-old today can't sit there and go, I will have a median 250K by the time I get to 60. But it's almost like we imply it's a conveyor belt, whereas actually it's a completely different set of rules now, really, for someone in their 20s.
Yeah, because a COVID hits or a 2008 hits or something like that. And yeah, things do change, but also the world around you changes. As you say, 30 years ago, having a certain amount of savings, that could have been even adjusted for inflation, maybe could have been a house deposit in a way that maybe it isn't now. Yeah, I mean, that's always the challenge with, I guess, planning ahead financially, or I guess in many other ways as well, that the world is going to kind of change around that as well.
It does you well not to look at too far ahead and go, oh, well, that's where I need to be, because they have certainty around things like state pension.
Yeah.
So, for example, they know that I'm getting that, whereas we don't. We don't know that. So we can't, like, to them, 50 to 60% of the UK population, state pension is half of their retirement. So it's a massive, like, safety blanket.
Yeah.
You know, to us, we probably have to plan that it's not going to be there.
It'd be very surpurring if the state pension disappeared.
Yeah, but
like,
I mean, they might just
tomorrow.
But
in terms of us,
they might inflate it away.
There's a much longer trajectory to look ahead to, and a lot more time in which that could happen.
So they could have a smaller retirement pot because of the certainty around the state pension, you know, or they've got a DB scheme, or, you know, like.
and that's really, I mean, it's worth saying, once to come back to the point that, there was a lot of uncertainty in the boomers' lives as well. And, when they got to working age, there was real challenges in terms of, or real worries at least, in terms of, are this massive cohort of people all going to be able to find jobs? Because suddenly, like each year, we've got we've got these big blocks of people coming through, and at the same time as the period of time where women haven't worked is actually relatively short in the middle of the 20th century, but during the kind of period in which the boomers are coming to age is also a period of time in which a lot of women who 10 years previously maybe would have stayed at home to look after children in that kind of stereotypical heterosexual couple with the woman at home and the are also entering the workforce. So you get kind of this double factor of just like a lot of people to find jobs for. And, in actual fact, over time, more people with more jobs means there's more stuff you need to make, and that kind of worked itself out. I think one of the big shifts, and this sort of going back to the pensions point, though, is kind of around stability. I think we've had this shift towards kind of a much more individualistic society, but also a much more individualistic way of looking at finance, looking at economics. So yeah, we've kind of moved away from that system of, you get a job and you get a kind of company pension scheme, and you're kind of like, the work will sort it out, and you walk, and you've got kind of maybe a state pension to back that up as well, to a kind of system where one view of it is that we have a lot more freedom. So I talked to David Willett, who's a conservative lord in the film, and he's like, it's great. Like, you've got a lot more freedom in terms of choosing where you invest your pension or whatever, which for some people I think is probably really important. I would imagine that the kind of listeners of this are probably have kind of like selected into probably being the people that maybe do value that, and going, I'm gonna, I want to make sure it's in a high risk, high growth kind of pot rather than having it all in bonds or whatever. For most people, whether they actually act on that freedom and whether that's something that they actually think is important and useful is maybe lower. But one of the kind of side effects of that has been that there is, I mean, as we were just saying about pensions, there is that lack of stability. If things go wrong, you're much more on your own as well. I think we've become a much more kind of succeed or sink kind of society, and we kind of see that in a lot of the kind of economics of the stuff we talk about, and we talk about like housing as well, in terms of, throughout much of the 20th century, the shift within the UK was that we would build a system of social housing, which if you were in need, and actually for a lot of the century, it was also like an option that you could choose. You could just go, I don't want to own a house. I want to rent a house from the council, and I'll have decent tenants' rights. It'll be reasonably affordable. We've kind of shifted away from that because, enough people liked the idea that, I can buy my house and this actually could be great for me. Like I could get really wealthy. I mean, how housing wealth actually translates into real wealth is maybe a different question.
You can't eat bricks.
Yeah, you can't eat bricks. Yeah. I think it's Mervyn King that said something about like it's housing wealth is like made up. It's a number, and other than the fact that it's money that you're not, it's like money that you're not spending rather than money that you have. Yeah. Which maybe that's all wealth, but yeah, we used to have all these kind of systems in place, and by my reading, one of the things that sort of enabled the boomers to have a reasonable kind of run at things were some of these fallbacks where we'd go, do you know what, if you end up in a really shit position, there's there's a decent rented housing option that doesn't exist anymore. So I think, there's probably an argument that you can sort of soar higher if you, and some people would say that's, if you have the pluck and ambition. Some people would say that's if you're in the right place at the right time. But I think we've unfortunately kind of got to a place where looking ahead at our potential hopeful retirements is a case of are we able to kind of get through, or do we have a really bad time of it, rather than do we have an all right time of it?
There feels like there's less wiggle room. People have less margin for error.
Yeah.
Another way that you showed this was that I thought was something I hadn't really considered is the environmental impact in terms of future generations can be less luxurious with their carbon output than the boomers were.
Yeah, so I mean, this is I don't want to take credit for this. This is something that David Willits comes up with in the film as well, and he says, they've run the numbers, and the amount of carbon that boomers burnt up through their lives is like relatively high, and that if we want to keep our carbon within kind of the limits that have been suggested, are going to at least ameliorate the effects, or not ameliorate the effects of global warming, but stop it being the worst that it can be. There are a level to which younger people are going to have to live slightly more restricted lives. And we hope that some of that will be through innovation, which will mean that some of the things that have been done previously can still be done, but in a slightly different way. But certainly at the moment, we're at a point where, if you want to do your bit or whatever, you have to think about, well, am I going to do that extra flight? Am I going to drive, or am I going to get the train or whatever,
I mean, in theory, that's kind of our responsibility as the future generation. But at the same time, like the boomers, like in the industrial revolution, everything, they all their outputs for like emissions and like electricity and pollution went up through the roof. And now we've got a president in America who's saying, forget the environment, we're going to drill everything and close all these reservation parks and screw the fish. So like,
Different kind of porn again.
No, it's hilarious. But like, what if I don't drive my car to here today? Is that really make a difference if Donald Trump's like, we're going to fish all the fish and we're going to drill everywhere? Is me not driving my car going to make a difference when the biggest cohort have just smashed up the planet, and then now little me, has to take the bus because they've all done the damage?
This has always been one of the arguments. One of the ones you'll see online quite a lot is, China is still burning coal in certain places. I mean, if we look at China, actually, the progress that they've made towards renewable energy has been like exceptionally rapid. And what's going to happen in the US is a really fascinating, I'm sure to different people, exciting or terrifying thing to watch. We've just had a couple of days ago, maybe it was yesterday actually, depending on when you're watching this, could be whenever, who knows. Donald Trump has like paused all government grants to everything, which, in terms of some of the kind of themes we're looking at throughout the film, in terms of one of the kind of big trajectories of the kind of second half of the 20th century was towards this world where we kind of don't really trust the government to do anything. It's not that it has a limited role to do in some places and other places where, we want to have that sort of market choice. We kind of got to this place where we were like, we don't think they can actually do anything. Like even the water pipes should be run by a private company in a way that I think you would really struggle to make a kind of good argument for. And we've seen like the real kind of taking that to the very extreme where, Donald Trump's kind of signed an executive order which got just gone, we're going to stop doing any government grants until we kind of figure it out. If they don't bring some of these back, I think we'll see like a real what happens when that experiment is taken to the extreme.
Trump's a boomer.
Guess. Trump is a boomer.
Who made his money on New York property.
Yeah.
He had a great time, hadn't he? He's like, right, all this needs to stop now.
I read a kind of an argument that he's like the
boomer.
The sort of
the big boom.
If you distill boomers down to their kind of like
ethanol
base sort of
little consomme.
And that's maybe an unfair look at it. In the US, kind of politically, boomers are relatively divided around kind of between political parties. What that means for like specific policies, I think is maybe a different question. And we don't want to sort of overlook that there are many boomers who have kind of, probably put a lot on the line to stop Donald Trump and similar kind of changes throughout history. But
I think one thing that we got called out for this in the comments, actually, thank you whoever did this, they were like, all you ever talk about is millennials and boomers. Like, I'm a Gen X, what about me? You showed that their lived experience was different, even just by a few years in the documentary. Can you just explain what you found there?
I mean, I think so. Yeah. So I think the point you're pointing to is that we kind of talk a little bit about the financial crisis 2008 and by the estimation, and I think this is in the US, and I think this was the sort of one of the Feds had sort of looked at the kind of Federal Reserves, I can't remember exactly which one, had kind of looked at it in terms of like who actually were the biggest losers of 2008 in terms of if you like who were the people that, so for anyone that's kind of like not super aware of what happened in 2008, basically house prices had gone up and up and up and up. Mortgage lenders had expanded their kind of scope for who they were willing to lend to. And then that they had expanded their scope so much that there was just like super risky loans. Everything sort of exploded as soon as house prices stopped going up. And so like the worst place to be with that was you've just bought a house and it's just lost a huge amount of its value. You owe a huge amount of money, which now you're in a recession, you can't afford to pay. And that all becomes like a bit of a spiral. Whereas for many baby boomers, not all, if you'd bought a house 20 years ago or however long previously, yes, the price of your house might have dropped by a substantial amount, but it's still worth 3 times what you bought it for, or substantially what you bought it for at least. It's not a great day, but it's not game changing. And so sort of some of the research points that if you were in that particular cohort, you were most likely to have been in that spot where you had just bought a house, being like, whew, great, that's really good, turned the keys, and then everything crumbles. And then because you're in a recession, you've also, maybe your job is on the line, and also everything else is looking much more challenging.
One of the worst things that I see in my world is scammers who pretend to be me or the podcast and then try and get money out of people who follow us. And sadly, these scammers are getting better and better by the day, which is one of the reasons that we're really happy that we're partnering up with Vanta, who help businesses be secure and then prove that they're secure. Vanta automates compliance for stuff like GDPR, ISO 27001, SOC 2 and more, helping businesses build customer trust. The beauty of Vanta is they save companies a lot of time and money because proving you're secure without them really is an enormous faff. It can take months of work and form filling. Over 9,000 companies like Atlassian, Flow Health and Cora use Vanta to manage their risk and prove their security in real time. If you need to prove that your business is secure and compliant, you can get $1,000 off by going to vanta.com/makingmoney. I've left a link in the description for you.
Do you think Gen Xers have had a raw deal growing up in the shadow of the boomers?
I mean, I think where you draw that line of what, I think sort of, to look back at that kind of like line between Gen X and millennial is sort of fictitious. There's some research which points to the idea that even later, in terms of kind of looking ahead at your life and whether you will experience social mobility, is that even kind of the last chunk of the boomers, like that was going down. Like if you were born in 64, you got a slightly worse deal than if you're born in 63, than if you're born in 62 or whatever. And we've kind of seen that continue to go forward. One thing we're seeing a little bit differently now, and this was a piece I was reading in the FT a couple of days ago, is that so over the past kind of 20 years, that kind of experience of generational divide, at least between the UK and the US, if not some other aspect of Europe and the US, has been relatively similar in terms of, the in terms of the brief contours of it, at least, like in a lot of the specific policy, it's kind of worked out in different ways. Some of the very specific challenges, but in terms of, you've got a cohort of baby boomers that have come through and sort of had some sense of stability. You know, some of them have had tough lives, some of them haven't, but like across the board, have had like some broad sense of kind of economic stability, some sort of sense of, I am going to do better than my parents. And then you've had cohorts afterwards that have gone, oh, that doesn't seem like it's going to happen to me. What we're seeing now is that actually, because the US economy has sort of been doing better than the European economy, actually in that kind of Gen Z kind of cohort, those experiences have begun to separate a little bit, where actually the sort of Gen Z bunch are kind of in a better place than maybe someone who was born 10 years ago would have been at the same age. Whereas in the UK and a lot of Europe, the kind of trajectory has unfortunately continued.
More to your point that, like, it's not just a time, it's a place, it's a, there's a lot of factors that go in. You're going to have a generation that go, oh, I'm US Gen X or US, or Europe, German Gen A Alpha or whatever. I want to ask you a question that was in your documentary. Someone put it to you kind of, and I want to see what you say. Basically it was, do you believe it's the actions of the individual that lead to success? Like, do you think that we're in control of our outcomes? Because I think within the documentary, it said that boomers are more likely to say they are, whereas modern younger people are more likely to say, my life outcomes are out of my hands.
Yeah, there's a chap called Kim Milburn we chatted to in the film, which in many senses like makes sense, right? If you are someone who has done well in life, whether you're a boomer or whatever, you probably want to say like, oh, that was down to me, I did that. If you are someone who has had a bit more of a raw deal, you probably don't want to go, oh yeah, that's my fault, I actually suck. And kind of the Keir sort of suggests that there's like a bit of a, I was going to say cleavage then, but I knew.
Yeah, you were doing the hands
I also
as well,
did
like,
this.
there was a bit of cleavage.
So there's like a bit. There's a sort of like distinction between boomers being more like to go like, yeah, I'm fucking rock. I bought a house at the right time, and I did that. I was clever. It's not that I happened to be 24 and houses were cheap. Like I was like, yeah, right. I've got
a great pension.
And like some of this is like a natural way to be. If you were just, most of us probably want to be able to attribute good things to ourselves and bad things to the world. Like that's a completely fair way of like rationalizing the universe and our place within it. I mean, it's a mix, right? I think in reality. I think what we are seeing at the moment, though, is we have shifted to, certainly in the UK, if maybe this is also true to a lesser or greater extent elsewhere in the world, a situation in which where you are born and to who is a big distinguishing factor in terms of what your life is going to look like.
Yeah.
And some of that, one of the things we've kind of sort of discussed a little bit as a country is in terms of the geography of that. If the economies of different parts of the UK are, effectively sort of London has ran away a little bit in the southeast and in the east. If you are born outside, if you're born in the like outside of London and the southeast, there are much sort of bigger challenges in terms of if you want to have like a professional career or whatever, or because if you want to do an internship or whatever, suddenly you've got to move to London. That's a whole thing. And whereas if your family lives here, you can, I don't know, you've got somewhere to stay, etc. But also inheritance has just become such a big factor in terms of those core. I think we keep coming back to housing, but it's just because it's such a fundamental like human need, right? I don't know my Maslow's hierarchy of needs well enough to be.
Yeah, where's
shelter?
Shelter's layer one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that the most?
I think shelter is layer one.
Shelter's number one, and then it's like food or comfort or something.
Yeah, so like that becoming super expensive is like a pretty big deal for a human being, right? And if buying a house like requires you to have a parent who can chip in a little bit, or if the kind of house you're able to buy or requires you to have a parent who can chip in, like that's a really big deal. If we talk about go back to employment being different and industry being much more different and more lucrative isn't the right word. If we talk about the economy of London doing much better, then even if you live somewhere else, if you want to be able to buy a house, or even if you have grown up in London and want to stay here, like that is, you possibly need some parental help to be able to buy the home here that is going to enable you to have that better paying job. And so in a kind of ideal universe, both of those factors in terms of the choices that you make and the context in which you exist are going to be factors in terms of how well you do, right? We probably all knew someone at school that was didn't do very well but tried really hard. We probably also knew people who did really well and put in no effort. And probably people who crossed over that, people who clearly weren't naturally ability and were like, oh fuck it, I'm going to try really hard, and then did really, really well. And people who maybe could have got great results and then couldn't be bothered. And the same is true of life to an extent. But yeah,
it's come back to that point about that you make, that we've looked at the standard that boomers have set and internalized it as the norm. But if you kind of look at the wider world, there's large parts of the world where you have no chance of escaping that place just because you were born there. Is it almost privileged of us to expect upward mobility in that sense?
I mean, I think, we are lucky to live in a time where we know that is a possibility. Like, we know that is a society that we can build. And I think one of the struggles politically at the moment as well is that if you kind of build a society in which everyone always expects to get a raw deal and everyone expects that they'll probably get less out than they put in, if they kind of expect that finding a job is going to be really hard, and they're probably going to be on stagnant wages that are the same that they've been for however long, that they're going to be kicked out of their house every year and have to find somewhere new, and it's going to be more expensive than it was. If prices in the supermarket are constantly going up and now you have to have your club card or it's £1 million for a sandwich, that's not great socially either. It's a challenge on a kind of sitting down with your Excel spreadsheet, working out next year's finances or looking forward to a pension and being like, what's the world going to look like? But it also massively affects how do we exist alongside the people we live alongside? How do we think about the country and the world in terms of how we vote and how we make those decisions collectively going forwards? So yeah, I think there's one. I think particularly in the UK, it feels like we're at on a bit of a kind of turning point almost in many ways in terms of, do we manage to find growth again? Do we manage to, do we sort out the housing crisis? Do we sort out some of these challenges? Or do we just go
It feels like we've found the can. We've been kicking it down the road a long time. And it's like, okay, the can is here. We can't kick this thing any further. But like you say, do we sort it or do we just go, we're just going to descend into...
Yeah. Do I just have 5 locks on my door and just hope no one comes for all my canned food that I've piled up in the cupboard? I don't think that maybe there are some people who want to live in that world. They're kind of full on preppers who are actually I've got all my cans downstairs.
7,000 baked beans in the cellar. I'm good to go.
I think most people don't want to live in that world because I probably don't think it's a very exciting one culturally and socially and all of those things.
You're not going to theatre, are you? On a Saturday?
Yeah.
Someone in our comments wrote that we always, I want to give them the benefit, that we always it's so hard life now in England and life is hard. And back in the day, it was so much easier and we don't get pensions anymore and the world sucks. But we have a lot of like opportunities that boomers didn't have. So like I worked for a Singaporean company, a company in Holland, living in London, living in Manchester, and I was getting paid London wages while the company was in Holland. So like we can work remotely now since COVID. We can like, I can go up to Manchester and live there or work
This is
there.
a job.
Yeah, this is
Yeah,
a job.
yeah.
We can work till we're older. You know, you could do this till we're like 90, 100. You can travel, you go on holiday, like more. We don't have a war currently. Well, we don't have a war currently. There are wars, but you know, we're not in war like they were. So like, there are a lot of benefits we have. We can do investments on apps. We can like, we've got more choices for our pension. We can invest in crypto. We can invest in like all sorts of things. We've got a lot more freedom and flexibility, and the cost of travel is cheaper. Cost of holidays are cheaper. So I know our pensions are pretty screwed and like a lot of things are bad, but we have a lot of benefits that they didn't have.
So one thing, I saw someone, and forgive me for not being able to remember who said this, but you know, sometimes when you hear something, someone phrases something in a really interesting way that just sticks with you and you're like, oh, that like untangles this for me in a really interesting way. I heard someone say that one of the big changes has been that like sort of luxuries have become much cheaper and much more accessible, right? You can probably both remember when like a flat screen TV or a big TV was like a big deal because that was incredibly expensive. And these days, like the kind of quality of TV that you can get, like there's some range, but like there's probably a limit to how good a TV you can buy.
You can spend a couple $100 on a good flat screen TV, can't you?
And the differences are kind of minimal. They become like, okay, you're paying a lot more for a slightly better TV. But the kind of necessities of life have become so much more expensive.
You can go on holiday, but you can't buy a house.
Yeah.
Whereas like to my mom, she didn't go on holiday. She didn't eat a red pepper until she was 25, she told me.
Yeah.
She was like, that was just like, it was exotic food.
People didn't go to restaurants and stuff.
Yeah.
But now the young people, they love eating out, drinking out, going to cinema. Well, not cinema, but yeah, going to meals and things.
You sound like a boomer, mate.
So
You're
like,
putting on some stereotypes here.
To be fair, one of the things that has happened with people slightly younger than us is that they don't go out so much, which is kind of complicated mixture of all kinds of things. Is partly the phones, is partly if it's £7 a pint, you sort of can't go. But I think one of the sort of dividing lines, which kind of which you know, it's important not to overlook in terms of the stuff of being able to go on holiday for, you know, not even that it's cheaper, that it's like possible to do that.
Cheaper than a train ticket to go to
incredible.
Europe than to get a train up north.
Easier to fly to Dubai than get a train to Manchester.
Honestly.
And, you know, some of those luxury, you know, we can have oranges aplenty. We can have like, you know, there's all those kind of like things where you go, yeah, no, that is, you know, we can make a sort of TV show thing here, right? And that's like not, you don't have to be the BBC to do that.
Yeah.
However, like the real kind of fundamentals of life. So I was making a project like about housing in the UK specifically earlier this year. And I saw data that was like I can't remember exactly what year it was, sort of during the 70s, I believe. Someone will have to correct me if I'm wrong. Like the average percentage of your pay that you spent on rent went down to like 8%. And, you know, even if we give that some wiggle room for either my memory being wrong or for
Double it and round it off.
the data,
happy with double it and
20% would be certainly in London, right? But actually in a lot of the country, that would be pretty good.
Anywhere there's jobs, anywhere there's like an inner city environment, it's going to be near 50%.
Yeah. Either somewhere that's luxuriously rural, or there's got too much stuff or not enough stuff. Right? Like that's going to be you're not going to get that.
Yeah.
So the kind of fundamental stuff of life has just become so much more expensive, whereas the kind of fun stuff has become, and like again, we shouldn't overlook that. I think that it is nice that we can travel and that we can sort of do all those things, that we have fun kind of stuff in our houses that we can, I don't even know what we're thinking of. TV, you know, we've got TVs and we've got
phones and VRs and all these kind of things.
Yeah. But kind of when push comes to shove, the kind of core stuff of life has become much more expensive.
I joked before that you sound like a boomer, and what I was getting at is the stereotypes that they like all sides sling at each other. And I think a boomer stereotype, again, I'm stereotyping here, but their pushback will be, I didn't go on holiday, I didn't eat out, and that's why I could buy a house. Whereas now it's like those things are relatively cheap. I mean, not anymore. Eating out's a joke, and Nando's is like a luxury meal now, it seems. But you know, those things are relatively cheap to today's generation. But buying a house is completely off the cards. It's like both project their experiences at each other, don't they?
Yeah.
You know, like to them, eating out was massive luxury, and going on a holiday was impossible. But now you can go to Spain for relatively cheap if you want.
And actually, I was chatting to David, who I speak to in the film, where he was like, actually, they sort of looked into it, and boomers are the people mostly eating out, like sort of in the sort of boat, like and doing the like
They're in the ivy, like all the millennials,
like doing the big cruises or whatever. Like
you just describing my mom,
like
Susan, millions of Susans just going out into the world.
But yeah. I mean, this is completely anecdotal, but I was watching Threads recently. You know, the sort of nuclear bomb in Sheffield. Sort of, it's this BBC TV program that came out. Oh, I'm not going to be able to
Is
say
it
what
really
day.
dark?
It's really dark.
Yeah.
It's like it's the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah.
It's the sort of narrative that exists around it. And the second half, well, most of it is about nuclear bomb gets dropped. I think it's Sheffield, and it's all horrible. But at the beginning, they're like setting up the characters, and it's like this like working class lad and his girlfriend, and they got loads of free time. They drive around. He looks after pigeons. He's a pigeon fancier, I was like, that's fun. But no one does that anymore.
I was waiting for that. I'm like, pigeon fancier.
I was like, oh, that's a hobby that's you never hear it. And they like get pregnant, and it's not ideal. But then they buy a house, and I was like, so obviously this is a story that you're watching, but you know, it's obviously not so ridiculous that when they broadcast this, people were like, how did they suddenly buy a house?
Yeah.
And I was like, it's so interesting that's like you couldn't make that film in quite the same way today, because people would just be like, well, that's not realistic. Impossible.
The nuclear threat might not be, but the
the
pigeon fancier lad who buys his own house is like that's alien. I wonder in 30 years if they look back at like, you know, the TV and media of today, how it will look alien to them. You know, like to my son who's 11, when he's like watching a show from a classic show from the 20s. Yeah. You know, what will it look like to him, and what will be how will it seem out of touch?
Yeah, what's the stuff that will, you know, will it be flights all the time, like people flying around? Will it be?
Yeah, like that might be completely, the idea of going on holiday might be completely out of it whack.
Yeah, it could just feel like, what a horrific person.
People retired, you know, like what's that? We work till the day we die kind of thing.
Yeah.
What does your mum think about the documentary and about the question around boomers? Because you have her in it.
Yeah, I mean, to go right back to what you said at the beginning, one of the things she says in the film is that I hadn't really thought about being a baby boomer until I rung her up. Because so in the process of like making the film, we've been sort of like planning out what it could look like. Making a film like this is really weird because you basically write it like 3 or 4 times. Because initially you sit down and you go like, hey, where are some of the places we'd like to go? Who are some of the people that we'd like to chat to? Where maybe might that sit in a film at the end? And then obviously you get to these places where you're speaking to people, and as I'm sure you find with this, you have your list of questions, but then you're just like, oh, this is the thing you just said actually is more interesting than the thing I was going to ask. So you kind of go down that end, or you're in a place and you go, when we went to Florida and we're in the sort of retirement community, and you don't know, you see you're like, oh, there's dancing at 8. Let's come back.
You can't script that.
Come back for the dancing. So then you're rewriting it on location, and then later on you're in the edit, you're kind of going, okay, what did we actually end up with? What now does stand, what doesn't, and and you kind of reassemble it then. So you end up writing it a bunch of times. But so initially we've been going, okay, well, what's a way that we could have some representation of like a boomer life arc through this that is like a bit easier to follow? That if you're watching it and I'm just going to go now in the 70s, this like very quickly you could just be like, sorry, how old are how old is your median boomer now? Like what's the like age range we're looking at? It can become very confusing. and we were like, oh, what if at one point we're going to do like a When Harry Met Sally thing, and we were going to get like loads of like couples of boomers to sit down and interview them. We were like, oh, what if we had like a story of like a idyllic boomer and I was like, well, that feels sort of false because we're just making it up. It's like, well, of course that happens in their life because we got to make it up.
Yeah.
And at some point I was just like, oh, my mum is like pretty bang on like median boomer in terms of when she was born. And it feels like she had a sort of fairly average, I guess, boomer life. Her and my dad both like, my mum was worked in a nursery. My dad was a police constable in the British Transport Police. So both did sort of like vocational jobs, but like kind of fairly ordinary jobs. Weren't like in management or something, but just kind of like did ordinary, and yet managed to experience like some social mobility, managed to buy a house, managed to get pensions, kind of like had what we would like maybe consider a vaguely ordinary life, other than obviously having me, which made it spectacular. And so like it felt kind of like a reasonable representation of, if you're going to pick one person and therefore it's always going to be someone's specific experience, it felt like an okay sort of one to go with. My hope is that it adds a kind of humanity to the film as well, because it's like my mum, and so I think the way that I interview her is slightly different to the way I chat to the other people. Yeah. But it was really interesting. So I called her up and was like, so I'm making this film about like baby boomers and the baby boom. Like I was wondering if you'd be up for being interviewed for it, as like, and we'll come to your house. And she was like, yeah, go on then, we'll see. And we'd had some sort of pre-chat, which was interesting in and of itself, that, yeah, she hadn't, and some of this didn't quite make it through to the actual thing, but there was loads of stuff that when I prompted, like, I'd just be like, oh, were there more people at school, or like, did you not notice because you were 5? And she was like, well, no, I didn't notice when I was 5 what the demographic situation was in terms of how many 5-year-olds there were, unsurprisingly. But she was like, when she left school, and then went to teacher training college, and then was becoming a teacher, she was like, oh yeah, it was a thing that there were fewer children, and there was a bunch of us that are trained to be teachers, and like, where would we teach? Because we don't need as many teachers anymore, because like the sort of final bit of the baby boom has kind of like weaned off a little bit. So it was interesting speaking with her and suddenly framing those things and kind of go, oh, did you notice that? And the ways in which suddenly she kind of spotted stuff, which, I mean, as we were saying earlier, like now when you were born feels like a really important thing. And I guess also the thing you were saying about, do you attribute successes or failures to yourself or to, if it feels like when you are born has been a particular sort of point of challenge around your life, you probably are going to be like, oh, I'm a Gen Z and I had to live through the COVID and the wake of the financial crisis and some of this stuff. Or if you are a boomer and you've had a little bit more stability through your life, maybe you don't have to, maybe you go, yes, my life was kind of about my agency. And also you maybe just don't have to think so much about when you were born, because that doesn't feel like a constraining factor, at least.
Yeah, the world revolves around you.
Yeah, to some extent.
But it's interesting that you do this thing with her, and you go, let's like say how much our houses were when we bought them, and you show the house value, and hers was like 17,000, and yours was like 250. I hope you don't mind me saying it's on the internet.
It's in the film.
Yeah. And then she goes, what's more interesting is the jobs that we did. Because she then says, I had like quote unquote normal job. And she's like, I don't even know what you do. You've got like quite an extraordinary job, and you need that job just to fulfill the life experience that she did at that age. Was kind of her point. Do you know what I mean?
She also goes, well, no, in some ways I think she's rationalizing it there in a really interesting, because I think she also she's like, oh, your house is nicer than the one we bought, which I do think is true without like giving them both a review. Our house is a little bit bigger. It's I don't know. It's maybe slightly nicer in some ways. It's it's damp because it's old rather than because it was badly built. But it's also still a house in Plymouth, right? It's not.
It's below the median house price of the UK as well.
Yeah.
Which I think is important to say.
So
That's depressing.
Yeah, that was like the limit. So that was like the limit of. Me and my wife's Help to Buy ISAs.
You're a successful YouTuber, one of the biggest in the UK, and you buy a mouldy house in Plymouth. That's the kind of median value. That's the modern.
But like, well, I mean, that's when you talk about this job, you sitting there interviewing me, like, if you were doing that job 30, 40 years ago, you would be like
a celebrity.
Like
a really big celebrity.
I was trying to think of a TV presenter, but the only one I can think of is not a great one now. Who's like a BBC News?
You're like Jimmy Savile.
I was about to say.
I was like, you'd be like Hugh Edwards, and I was like, I don't.
Oh God!
Who's
Jimmy Savile.
Hugh Edwards is like
who's like a Trevor
Parky.
McDonald. Yes, you would be Michael
Trevor
Parkinson.
McDonald.
Okay, you'd be Parky. That's a good.
so far. No, we don't know.
So like, yeah, and again, that comes back to that sort of like the jobs that seem spectacular in their eyes maybe are a bit more routine, right?
Yes. Yeah, because they were, like one thing that my mum would always say is that TV presenters back then were like rock stars. Whereas now it's, I mean, the amount of people that I meet that are like, oh, I'm a social media influencer. It's kind of shocking. But and obviously I mix in the circles, but I encounter people, or when I know someone, they're like, oh, my mate is this and this. It's becoming more normal. It's like, it's not like this rare thing. Lots of people do it, and more people are doing it.
Particularly
not
spectacular, I guess.
Not to the level that you're like a household name. I'm by no means a household name. You could have 10 million people following you and not be a household name.
Yeah.
In the modern world, which is crazy.
Yeah. It's fascinating. To come back to your point, so it was interesting to see her kind of like trying to rationalize it in a way that maybe made some sense, but didn't entirely account for like quite the difference. Because you sort of want to be able to explain that. Like, I think it's difficult to.
It's a defense mechanism almost.
Yeah, which is
because they get attacked a lot, don't they? The boomers, they get you had it all. You're so lucky. And
I hope I hope my mum didn't feel attacked in my interview with her, and I think she's like reasonably sort of aware, but it was interesting having the chat like when those things did come through, of just going like, oh well, it's because of this reason, and you're like, maybe a bit, but also just it's very different.
There's a lot of hindsight as well. We know where the boomers have ended up, right? But when you go back to say the 70s and the 90s and high interest rates there was loads of periods that were awful to live through. And I wonder if in 30 years we look at it and, maybe the millennials have ended up okay in a different set of ways. And we're all like, oh, it actually all kind of came out in the wash, and I'm sure the property market's not going to be fixed overnight and there's going to be issues there. But I wonder if we extrapolate it out and it's the same. And if we'd have lived through the 70s or the 90s, would we have said, this is amazing? The early 90s and the interest rate rises at 15%, would we have been like, oh yeah, this is all just part of the great life of a boomer?
Quite possibly. I mean, I think the thing we can learn from it is, what were the decisions that were made at a sort of political level that maybe could have seen that life experience continue. Do you know what I mean? Could have seen that trajectory still be something that we could, that we could still have upward social mobility as a kind of broad expectation. Not that your life is going to be, not that everyone's going to be a millionaire. I guess money's a limited resource, so it doesn't quite work like that. But that your standard of living could be greater than your parents. And I think until 20 years ago, the broad sense was that was a given, right? That was kind of a broad expectation of life, where now that's kind of come into question. So I think the thing we can learn is, okay, well, why did that happen, and what can we, what might we do differently going forward?
I think that's a beautiful way to end the discussion now. I think the one thing that I took from your work and from your documentary on this is, you know, the generation thing is important. We all live through these periods, but we're all a lot of individuals and we all have lived experience. And even within the boomers, they didn't all get it handed to them on a plate, you know. And I think I'm guilty of making these general stereotypes and sweeping generalizations and it totally ignores the individual lived experience of millions of people, you know. And I think that we could all do with just stop slinging, you know, generational mud at each other basically, and going, oh, you had it all this way, or and you've stolen all my wealth and all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and there's plenty of boomers who have kind of seen some of those changes and are like, yeah, I benefit from this, but also it sucks. Like, also, this is bad. This isn't a world I want to live in.
Not at the Village, though. Those guys were all happy.
In Florida.
Yeah, those guys were living.
Little golf carts driving
life.
Around, spinning the...
Honestly, they were living better life than I did in my
It made me look forward to my retirement. I'm going to
that's
Florida.
when we're going to the Village. The Village, there's a lot of action going down there. Like, you know, they're having a great time.
We could be neighbours and do our
There
little
was like cocktails and dancing and
So the sort of rumour about the Villages is that they're all swingers.
I was going to say rampant STIs.
Yeah,
I bet there is.
Dancing parties.
So where we are,
A lot of itchy groins.
Activities all day long.
So
I'm
this never made it into the film because it was like, because sometimes you're like, oh, there's this interesting thing, but also if we go down that road, that's like 10 minutes, and like we don't have that much. But one of the interviews, I was chatting, like, I think this does make it into the thing, and I'm just like, oh, what's it like to live here? She's like, yeah, it's wonderful. Like, people say things about us, it's not true. And then like goes back into it. And I was like, if you hadn't said that, no one would like know that there was any like accusations or whatever. You just come across like a bit cagey. But it was great to visit.
Look like they're having a good time. Is that why you stay for 3 days?
Yeah. We thought we'd enjoy
research.
And you were like, when could I come here? Yeah, there's like guys that were like 40 there. They were just like, it's so good here. It was a great conversation. If you hope to retire to the Village one day so you can get actively in the swinging scene, we've put together a guide on pensions for you that will help get you there.
I'm going out to Florida to check it out.
I'm sure you are, you filthy sort.
Do some research.
Oh yeah, research.